Welcome to my YouTube channel at Sci-Fi Tales Pools. Please subscribe, like, and share to support my channel. Luke Morgan stood on the high ridge, looking down at the valley. Where the palace shone in the afternoon light, the banners of Queen Elena moved in the wind, and the walls looked strong. But today there was fear in the air. The sound of horns rose from the east side of the valley. And riders appeared on the horizon. They were not friendly riders. Their armor was dark, and their flags carried no sign of peace. Luke knew this was not a patrol. He had seen such riders before, and they brought nothing but fire and pain inside the palace. Princess Claire was in the great hall with her tutors. The tall windows let in the sun, and she could see far over the gardens. She was only 12, but she had the calm eyes of her mother, the queen. The lessons ended, and she was about to walk to her room when the alarm bells rang. She froze in place as soldiers ran past the doors. The sound of boots echoed through the hall. Luke left his position on the ridge and ran toward the palace gates. His orders were to hold the line at the outer road. But he could see the enemy riders moving fast toward the heart of the valley. He had no time to wait. He passed the guards at the first gate, shouting for them to close the walls and gather the archers as he entered the main courtyard. The first wave of arrows fell from the sky. The clatter of steel rang in the air in the confusion. Princess Claire was led by two palace maids toward a side corridor. But the enemy broke through faster than expected. The dark riders poured into the hallways. One of them grabbed Claire before she could reach the hidden stair. The maids screamed and tried to hold her, but they were struck aside. Claire kicked and struggled, but the man lifted her and carried her away. Through a side door, Queen Elena was in the war chamber speaking with her captains. When the news came her daughter had been taken, she gripped the edge of the table, as if holding herself steady. Her voice was steady, but her eyes burned with pain. She ordered every rider and soldier to follow the trail, but the attackers had planned well. Smoke-filled the lower city, and the streets were blocked with fallen beams and burning carts. Luke heard the shouts about the princess, and without thinking, he left the fight at the gates. He saw the side door still swinging open and the footprints in the mud. He followed them across the garden, and over the outer wall he could hear the hoofbeats of the horses carrying the riders and the princess away. He pushed himself harder, running through the fields and over small streams. By the time the enemy crossed the far hills, the sun was sinking. The riders disappeared into the dark forest. Luke stopped to catch his breath. His heart pounded and his legs ached, but he knew he could not stop. He had to go. After her, he turned toward the forest and stepped into the shadows, knowing that every moment lost made the path colder. Back in the palace, the queen stood alone on the balcony, looking toward the same forest. The air smelled of smoke, and the cries of the wounded drifted up from the courtyards. Her hands were clenched at her sides. She could still remember the last time she had held her daughter that morning when Claire had smiled and said she would see her later. The queen swore silently that she would see her again, no matter what it cost in the forest. Luke moved carefully. The sounds of the night creatures filled the dark, but he listened for the hoofbeats. Ahead he followed broken branches and faint marks in the earth. His eyes adjusted to the dim light, and his mind stayed fixed on the image of the young girl being carried away. He thought of the look on the queen's face. If he came back without her, he thought of the weight of silence that would fill the palace if she was lost. As the night deepened, Luke found the remains of a campfire. The ashes were still warm. He knew he was close. He wrapped his cloak tighter and moved forward through the trees. His body was tired, but his will was strong. He had not chosen to be her guardian, but now that duty was his, and he would not fail. Luke walked deeper into the forest with his hand on the hilt of his sword. The air was cool, and the smell of damp leaves filled his lungs. The moonlight broke through the branches in silver streams, lighting his path. He moved quietly, careful not to step on twigs that might break under his boots. He had learned long ago that silence was a friend in the wild. His eyes scanned every shadow, searching for signs of the riders who had taken the princess. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and mud, but here and there he found the marks of horses' hooves. He followed them over small ridges and through narrow clearings. He could hear the faint sound of water ahead. Soon he reached a shallow stream. The water glimmered in the moonlight. He stepped in without hesitation, letting the cold soak his boots. The stream showed more tracks leading north in the distance. A faint orange glow flickered against the darkness. It was the light of a fire. Luke crouched low and moved closer, his heart beat. Steady, he had learned to keep fear away by focusing on each small task, one step forward, one glance ahead. One breath at a time. When he reached the edge of a small clearing, he saw them. The riders had stopped for the night, their horses tied to trees, their armor stacked near the fire. Luke's eyes searched for the princess, found her seated on a log, her wrists bound, but her head lifted. She was looking at the sky as if holding on to hope. 2 guards sat near her, one half asleep, the other sharpening a blade. Luke studied the camp, counting the enemies. There were more than he could fight in open battle. He would have to wait and find the right moment. Hours passed, the fire burned low, and the men grew restless. Some drifted into sleep, others wandered into the woods to gather more wood. When the clearing grew quiet, Luke moved. He crept to the edge where Claire sat. She saw him, and her eyes widened, but she stayed still, as he had taught young pages in the palace not to make sudden moves. He placed a finger to his lips and worked at the knots on her wrists. When the ropes fell away, he took her hand and led her toward the stream behind them. One of the guards stirred, but the wind moved in the branches above, masking their steps. They reached the water and crossed quickly. Luke knew the riders would discover her missing soon, and they would hunt them through the night he chose. A narrow deer path that twisted through thick brush to hide their trail. Claire held his hand tightly as they moved. She was tired, and her steps slowed, but she did not complain. Luke lifted her over fallen logs and guided her around thorn bushes. The forest was alive with small night sounds, but no sound of pursuit, yet he knew it would come. He found a hollow under a fallen tree, where they could rest for a moment. He gave her a drink from his flask and broke a piece of dry bread for her. She ate in silence, her eyes never leaving his face. When they set out again, the moon was high, and pale light washed over the land. They moved steadily through the trees and into a marshy stretch, where the ground sucked at their boots. Luke pushed forward, knowing that the wet ground would make it harder for horses to follow at last. They reached a rocky slope, where small caves dotted the hillside. He chose one deep enough to hide them from view. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of stone. He let Claire rest while he kept watch at the cave mouth. His mind stayed sharp, thinking of the safest route back to the palace. The riders would not give up easily, and they might send word to others ahead. On the roads, he knew the return would be as dangerous as the rescue itself, but he also knew he would see this through until the princess was home. The first light of dawn touched the forest, and the air was cold. Luke stepped out of the cave and looked around. The mist hung low over the ground, and the trees stood still in the quiet. He listened for any sound of pursuit, but there was only the call of birds in the distance. He returned to the cave, where Claire was waking. Her hair was tangled, and her eyes heavy with sleep. But she sat up quickly when she saw him. She asked if they were safe, and he told her they would keep moving toward home. They left the cave and began the long walk down the rocky slope. Luke kept his sword ready, and his eyes moving over every shadow. The ground was uneven, and Claire stumbled more than once, but Luke caught her each time without slowing their pace. As they reached the edge of the forest, they saw the wide plain that stretched toward the hills beyond. The open ground was dangerous, but they had to cross it before the riders closed and the sun climbed higher and the heat began to rise. Luke gave Claire small sips of water from his flask, and they walked along a line of low shrubs for cover. In the distance, he thought he saw movement, and his grip on the sword tightened. A small group of riders was moving across the plain, their armor glinting in the sun. They were still far, but Luke knew they had been spotted. He turned to Claire and told her to run for the line of trees ahead while he stayed close behind. They ran as fast as they could, the dry grass brushing against their legs. The sound of hoofbeats began to grow behind them. Luke urged Claire forward until they reached the trees. Once inside the shade, he led her along a narrow path that twisted through the undergrowth. The riders followed, but the thick trees slowed them, and the noise of their horses crashing through the brush echoed in the air. Luke and Claire reached a shallow river. The water was clear and cold. Without stopping, he lifted Claire onto his back and stepped into the stream, letting the current wash away their tracks. He moved downstream for some distance before stepping out onto a bank covered in reeds. The riders reached the river moments later and stopped searching the ground, but the flowing water had hidden the trail. Luke and Claire slipped deeper into the trees, and the sound of the riders faded behind them as the sun began to set. Luke found a small clearing where a fallen tree made a good shelter. He gathered dry branches and started a small fire to keep them warm. Claire sat beside him, eating a small piece of bread from his pack. She asked if they would reach the palace soon, and he told her he would see her there safe and sound. She smiled faintly and leaned against him, her trust giving him strength. Later that night, Luke stayed awake watching the edge of the clearing. The fire burned low, and the forest was still. He thought about the queen waiting for her daughter, and about the moment she would see Claire again. He imagined the relief in her eyes, and the end of the fear that had gripped the palace since the attack. He also thought of the danger that still lay ahead. The roads could be blocked and enemy scouts might be waiting, but he knew he would face whatever came. When the first stars appeared, Luke gently covered Claire with his cloak. He sat beside her with his sword across his knees and his eyes on the dark trees beyond. The clearing, his body was tired and his wounds ached, but his will was unbroken. He had made a silent promise in his heart to the queen and to the princess, and he would not fail that promise. The morning sun rose over the forest, casting long shadows between the trees. Luke woke first and gently shook Claire from her sleep. They had to keep moving. The air was cool and a light wind carried the scent of grass and fresh water. They left the clearing and followed a game trail that led toward the hills. Luke knew that beyond those hills lay the valley of the palace. The path was rough with roots and stones, but they pressed on without rest by midday. They reached a ridge that gave a view of the wide fields stretching toward the horizon in the far distance. They could see the faint shape of the palace walls. Claire stopped and stared, her eyes wide with hope. Luke placed a steady hand on her shoulder and told her they were almost home. But there was still danger between them and safety. He scanned the land below and saw no sign of riders. Yet they began the descent into the open fields. The sun was warm on their backs, and the grass brushed against their legs. Luke kept his eyes moving, watching for movement among the tall grass. They crossed a shallow stream and passed an old stone bridge. Where moss grew thick on the stones, the bridge was quiet. But Luke felt a tension in the air that told him they were being watched as they neared a grove of trees at the edge of the field. 3 armed men stepped out blocking their path. Their armor was worn, and their faces rough from days in the saddle. They carried swords, and their eyes narrowed at the sight of Luke and Claire. Luke stepped forward. Placing himself between the men and the princess, he told them they were returning to the palace, and that they should let them pass. The men laughed, and one reached for Claire. Luke moved fast, drawing his sword in one smooth motion. The fight was quick but fierce. Luke parried the first blow and struck the man across the arm, sending his sword clattering to the ground. The second man rushed in, and Luke dodged his swing before striking him hard enough to send him sprawling. The third man hesitated, then turned and fled into the trees. The 2 on the ground groaned and crawled away. Luke wasted no time. He took Claire's hand and led her quickly toward the grove once under the cover of the trees. They moved faster. The shadows kept them hidden from any who might still be watching. The land began to rise, and soon they reached the crest of the final hill. From there, the palace gates stood clearly in view, the banners of Queen Elena flying proudly in the breeze. Claire gasped and began to run, her small steps quick and eager. Luke followed close behind, his heart pounding with relief. The guards at the gate saw them and shouted. The heavy doors swung open, and soldiers rushed forward to meet them. Luke slowed as they reached the courtyard, his legs heavy from the long journey. The soldiers surrounded them with cries of surprise and joy, and word spread quickly through the palace halls that the princess had returned. Queen Elena was in the throne room when the news reached her. She rose at once and hurried through the corridors, her robe sweeping behind her. When she stepped into the courtyard, her eyes fell on Claire, and she ran forward. Claire broke from Luke, sighed, and leapt into her mother's arms. The queen held her tight, her face buried in her daughter. As hair tears falling freely, Claire whispered, "Yes, Mom, I'm safe thanks to him," and pointed toward Luke. The queen looked at the soldier, and in her eyes was deep gratitude. She stepped toward him and took his hand, speaking words of thanks that carried the weight of her heart. She ordered the healers to tend to his wounds and told the court that his bravery had brought the princess home. The soldiers cheered, and the sound filled the courtyard. Luke felt the weight of the journey lift from his shoulders. He looked around at the smiling faces and at the queen, Still holding her daughter, he knew his duty was done, yet he also knew that if called again, he would stand for them without hesitation, for in his heart, he had found a purpose that no title or reward could match. Days passed since Claire had returned to the palace. The halls were filled with joy and the sound of music. The gardens were bright with fresh flowers, and the people of the city gathered outside the walls to celebrate the safe return of their princess. Yet in the midst of the celebration, Luke preferred the quiet corners of the palace grounds. He often sat by the old fountain in the inner garden, where the sound of water was calm and the air was cool under the shade of tall trees. The queen had ordered that Luke be given the finest room and every comfort, but he asked for little. He wore no medals and made no speeches. Instead, spent his days walking the walls, speaking with the guards, and training in the yard, as he always had. The soldiers respected him for his skill, and for the way he treated even the youngest squire with patience and kindness. Claire visited him often, bringing fresh bread from the kitchen or flowers. She had picked herself. She liked to sit beside him and tell him about her lessons or the stories she read in the royal library. She would ask him about his travels, and though he spoke simply, she listened with wide eyes, as if every word was a treasure in her mind. She had no doubt that he was the bravest man she had ever known. One evening as the sun set, the queen came to the garden where Luke sat. She told him that the council had agreed to grant him the title of royal guardian, a position of great honor. Luke bowed his head and accepted, though his heart was humble. She told him that she trusted him not only with her life, but with the life of her daughter, and the safety of the kingdom. Word of his new role spread quickly, and the people cheered his name when he passed through the streets. But Luke never let it change him. He still rose at dawn to train and walked the grounds to watch over the gates. He spoke to the farmers in the fields outside the city and helped mend broken fences. He believed that protecting the land was as important as protecting the palace. Time moved on, and the memory of the raid began to fade, though the story of Claire's rescue was told again and again in the market and in the taverns. It became a tale of courage and loyalty, a reminder of what one man could do when he refused to give up. The people spoke of the night when the princess had been taken, and how a lone soldier had gone into the dark to bring her home. One spring morning, Claire brought Luke a small wooden box. She had carved it herself. Inside was a simple silver pendant shaped like a shield. She said it was so he would always remember that he was her hero. Luke took it with a smile and promised he would keep it always from that day. He wore it on a thin cord under his tunic, close to his heart. As the years passed, Luke remained at the queen's side, serving with quiet strength. He guided young soldiers, teaching them the value of honor and the meaning of duty. Claire grew into a wise young woman, and often spoke of the lessons she had learned from the man who had once carried her through the forest under the moonlight. In time, the bond between the soldier, the princess, and the queen became a symbol for the kingdom. It was a story told to children at night and to young warriors before they took their oaths, a story that said no matter how dark the road or how far the journey, a single act of courage could bring light to the whole land. And so the memory of that day lived on, not just in the palace, but in every heart that called the kingdom home. Thank you for watching and being part of our community.